Hello, and welcome to the State of 911 webinar series hosted by the National 911 Program. My name is Sherry, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This webinar Sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty in getting my There we go. This webinar series is designed to provide useful information for the 911 stakeholder community about federal and state participation in the planning, design, and implementation of Next Generation 911, or NG911 systems. It includes real experiences from leaders utilizing these processes throughout the country. Today's session will feature presenters from both the federal and state levels discussing the Digital 911 Readiness Checklist and coordinating 911 and Department of Defense activities in Washington State. David Firth, the Deputy Chief with the Federal Communications Commission Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Mark Buchholz, the Director of Willamette Valley 911 Communications Division and Chair of the Joint SAFECOM NICSWIC NG911 Working Group, along with Gerald Jaskolski, DHS Office of Emergency Communications and the Federal Lead for the Joint SAFECOM NICSWIC NG911 Working Group, will share information on the Digital 911 Readiness Checklist. Adam Wasserman with Washington State will discuss he's the Enhanced 911 Coordinator, and he will share information on coordination activities between 911 and the Department of Defense in Washington State. For more information on National 911 Program webinars or to access archived recordings or learn more about the National 911 Program, please visit 911.gov. The presentation from today will be posted on 911.gov shortly after the webinar. Feedback or questions about the webinars can be sent to National 911 Team at mcp911.com. If you are experiencing difficulty with the WebEx application, please call WebEx Technical Assistance at 1-866-229-3239 and select option 1. Please note that all participants' phone lines have been put in a listen-only mode and that this webinar is being recorded. To ask questions of our presenters, feel free to take one of two actions. Using WebEx's chat feature located near the bottom of your screen, click the chat icon to open the chat feature and to enter your question at any time during the presentation, and your question will be entered into the queue. This feature is not visible while your screen is in the expanded page view. Or to ask your question live, use the raise hand feature to request your phone line to be unmuted, and you will be called upon to ask your question. With that, I'd like to introduce Ms. Lori Flaherty, Coordinator for the National 911 Program. Lori, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sherry, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers today. As Sherry mentioned, our first two speakers are David Firth and Mark Buchholz. David, as she mentioned, is the Deputy Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the FCC. I've known David for years. We like to joke that we have each other on speed dial. He's one of the most active advocates for 911 that you could hope for in the federal government, and I feel lucky to be able to work with him on an ongoing basis. Mark, as Sherry mentioned, his day job is with the Willamette Valley 911 Communications Division in Oregon, but he's also the chair of the Joint SAFECOM NICSWIC NG911 Working Group, and they've frankly taken sort of picked up where the FCC's advisory group left off with this NG911 Readiness Checklist, and I'm looking forward to hearing about where they are with that. So, gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, this is David Firth. Thank you, Lori, for the introduction, and I'm going to lead off this presentation, and my job really is to be the prologue, because what this presentation will focus on is the digital next generation 911 readiness self-assessment that SAFECOM and NICSWIC have put together, and Mark is going to talk about that. What I am going to talk about is the task force on optimal PSAP architecture, what we refer to typically as TFOPA, and the work that it did from 2014 to 2016 that then has been picked up by SAFECOM and by NICSWIC. So let's go, Sherry, if we can go to the next slide. So just a little bit of an introduction to TFOPA. This was a federal advisory committee that was chartered by the FCC from December 2014 to December 2016. So it had a 2-year charter. And many of you may be familiar with federal advisory committees. The FCC has a number of them. Other agencies do as well. And advisory committees are convened by federal agencies, as the name suggests, to provide expert advice on topics that the agency chooses. And so, as part of the FCC's work on 911 issues, the Commission decided in 2014 to convene a task force that would specifically look at the next generation 911 transition from the perspective of the PSAP and the perspective of the 911 architecture that would support the PSAP in a next generation 911 environment. And so TFOPA was formed in December of 2014 with that mission. The task force consisted of a wide range of 911 experts. We had PSAP directors, we had state 911 administrators, representatives from federal and state government. We had industry, the wireline and wireless carriers were represented, many in the technology community and in the 911 service industry. So it was truly a very auspicious panel of experts. When the task force first met in December of 2014, the introductions around the room led somebody to remark that at that table were sitting people with collectively about 800 years worth of experience with 911. So it was truly a panel of experts. And the task force at the Commission's directive then split into 3 working groups, and they are outlined here. The first working group was focused on cybersecurity and on looking at cybersecurity risks and solutions from the PSAP perspective in the transitional and in the next generation 911 environment. The second working group, and that's the one that we'll be focusing on in this presentation, was the working group that looked at next generation 911 architecture and what are the options for implementing that architecture, both from a technically efficient point of view, from a cost-effective point of view that will best serve the interests of PSAPs and of the public. And then the third working group looked at the issue of funding and looking at funding models and ways to ensure that the next generation 911 transition can be adequately funded. So this task force took on an enormous number of very complicated issues at a critical time in the evolution of 911. And let's go to the next slide. The output from that task force is very briefly summarized here, and I would recommend that if you're not familiar with the work that TFOPA did, you should go to the Commission's website. The link to the Commission's website and all of the presentations and reports from TFOPA are at the webpage that's indicated on the slide. And there's a lot of material there. I think that it's been very useful, certainly to the Commission from the perspective of shaping our policies with respect to 911, but this is also an enormously valuable resource for 911 administrators, for PSAP directors, for state and local government all over the country as they face the challenge of transitioning from legacy 911 to next generation 911. So the task force met several times a year, convened the working groups, which had weekly conference calls, did enormous amounts of work, and of course these were all people that had day jobs. So the amount of dedication was truly phenomenal. And at the end of the first year, in January of 2016, the TFOPA put out a consolidated final report and recommendations that consolidated all of the guidance and all of the recommendations from the three working groups into a single document. It's about 200 pages, and it is still considered really one of the authoritative roadmaps on all of the issues relating to the next generation 911 transition. And so we're delighted to see the follow-through that we'll be talking about later in this webinar on some of those recommendations. So after the first year, TFOPA did its consolidated final report, but its work was not done, and in fact, the members really wanted to keep going because as they put together that consolidated report, they recognized that there was going to need to be follow-up on a number of issues. So in the second year of the charter, between January and December of 2016, when TFOPA's charter ended, the working groups went back to work, and each of them produced a supplemental report. And the Cybersecurity Working Group 1 produced a report on an optimized, a recommended cybersecurity approach for PSAPs. The second working group put together what was referred to as the Next Generation 911 Readiness Scorecard, and that's going to be the focus of Mark's presentation. And then the Working Group 3 put together a model for sustainable funding for Next Generation 911. So all of these resources are available. They are tremendously valuable resources, and they have influenced a lot that has happened since December 2016. With respect to the Readiness Scorecard, what the working group and TFOPA was focused on was how do we take all of the recommendations on how to develop next generation 911 architecture and actually turn it into a practical roadmap that PSAPs and 911 authorities and state legislatures and others can look at to figure out where they are on the path to transition. Because every time you hear the phrase that someone is next generation 911 capable, that means typically a whole lot of different things to a whole lot of different people. And the beauty of the scorecard is that the task force looked at all of the stages of the transition and all of the necessary steps in the transition, and said, let's put together essentially a flow chart that identifies these are the things that must be implemented at different stages of the transition, so that if you want to say that you are next generation 911 capable at a certain level of maturity, these are the things you must have done by that stage. And if you haven't done them yet, then you need to work on those things in order to get to that stage. So that was the work that the task force did when the task force charter ended in December 2016. And then from there, I'm delighted to see the work that has gone into really implementing the readiness scorecard and making it into a tool that can be used by 911 authorities around the country as they face the challenge of the next generation 911 transition. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark because he's going to talk about where things have gone since TFOPA produced that report and that scorecard.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks, Sherry and Lori, for allowing me the opportunity to speak today about the advancement or progress, I guess, moving forward with the self-assessment. So first of all, just a little further background on myself. Again, I'm Mark Buchholz, and I'm the director of a regional 911 center based in Salem, Oregon, on the West Coast, referred to as Willamette Valley. On the East Coast, I guess, referred to as Willamette Valley. Anyway, I've been in the business for about 30 years. Matter of fact, just passed my 30-year milestone working in 911 communications, and I've had the opportunity to be a member of SAFECOM for the past 4 years. Today, my focus will be just to share the progress, how it came about, and why we're we're moving forward with further, I guess, advancement of the readiness self-assessment. Let me first provide a little bit of background here. So at the top of the slide, you see SAFECOM, NICSWIC, Next Gen 911 Working Group. So what does all that mean? And for those who are not familiar, let me just touch on SAFECOM. SAFECOM is a communications program within the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Emergency Communication. SAFECOM was formed in 2001 following the 9/11 terrorist attack as a part of the presidential initiative to improve public safety communications and interoperability. The NICSWIC portion, the National Council of Statewide Interoperability Coordinators, which every state has one. There's a statewide interoperability coordinator for every state, and collectively they are the National Council. Their purpose is the promotion and coordination of activities designed to ensure the highest level of public safety communications across the nation. Of course, put the two efforts together, we both have the same interest. SAFECOM and NICSWIC host joint meetings on topics of interest to both organizations. One of those topics is Next Gen 911. Hence, the formation of a joint working group, the Next Gen 911 Working Group. So that's the background of where the group came from. That working group's got a primary mission, and that mission is to identify, document, and develop work products that will facilitate the transition of Next Gen 911 nationwide. Next slide, Jerry. So work products. And first I just want to touch on a work product that the work group is about to complete, just as an example, and that product is the Cyber Risks to 911 paper or primer. This document should be out later this year and provide an introduction to the 911 systems, discuss the 911 cybersecurity risk landscape, and provide readers resources to improve their cybersecurity posture. I would say hopefully within the next couple of months that'll be out and available to share. Now let me move on to the main purpose of my opportunity today, and that's to talk about the readiness self-assessment. Let's see, making sure I'm covering everything on the slide here. All right, actually, Sherry, let's go to the next slide. As David mentioned, the TFOPA was an effort convened by the FCC, went through all the work he described, and out of that working group number 2, Phase 2 supplemental report is the readiness self-assessment. It was subject matter, I got to slow down so I'm not talking too fast here. Subject matter experts throughout the 911 community developing this scorecard to help for a smooth transition to the Next Gen 911 environment. Let's see here. TFOPA, I think David covered most of that. Sherry, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so specifically talking about the readiness self-assessment. The benefits and the purpose of the self-assessment was to increase the understanding of Next Gen 911 systems elements, the awareness of the Next Gen 911 maturity continuum, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and assist in the planning of Next Gen 911 transition steps and enable a consistent terminology for the Next Gen maturity model. So when we're talking about where are we and what stage is every single PSAP, we could use common terms and everyone would be familiar with what they mean. Next slide, please, Sherry. All right. So in this slide, a couple of things we want to separate. First of all, the Next Gen 911 continuum has 6 maturity states or stages. And if you look in the center of the screen, the stages go from legacy to the national end state. that would be an environment where all of our PSAPs in the nation have moved to next generation 911. So you can see the maturity states: legacy, foundational, transitional, intermediate, and so on to the national end state. Individual PSAPs, as they evaluate the readiness self-assessment, their target will be jurisdictional end state. And of course, if we can have all the PSAPs reach that target, we'll reach the final target, which is national end state, moving entire network nationwide to Next Gen 911. Within the assessment, we cover 9 different areas of interest within the Next Gen 911 transition. Those include governance, routing, GIS, core services, network, PSAP, call handling, applications, security, operations, and then optional interfaces as they may pertain to each PSAP. Next slide. So due to the constraints for the working group and the need for the document, for a document-based product that can be included in the final report of the working group's effort, the self-assessment was a static spreadsheet embedded with non-editable PDF file. So if you look at the screen, basically spreadsheet layout. We talk about the first part, and this you'll find right within the documents that David referred to earlier. Governance, and it would show governance, structure, design, and framework, and then you would have to identify what the status is, who it's maintained by, and any notes pertaining to each of these items within the category of governance. We felt, as we were looking for product development that would help the community, we took a step as a working group and pulled the assessment out and handed it to a number of different PSAP managers and asked them to fill out the form, figure out where we were, where help was necessary for improvement. Next slide, Sherry. So after the review and the attempts, we realized that the need to expand the concepts in the TFOPA report was extremely evident. So the Next Gen 911 Working Group embarked on an effort to transform the self-assessment to make it more useful across the 911 communities. We're working with the original TFOPA subject matter experts and the National 911 program to make this possible. The goal was not to change the intent of what the TFOPA team put together, but to try to enhance it, make it easier for PSAP managers and others to fill out the form, know what's to be put in each of the boxes. And so that is the work that's been underway so far. So next slide, Sherry. All right, here's a sample view of the update, just seeing the change from the original spreadsheet that you saw. This is what the tool looks like today as we're making progress in the development. We're continuing to refine the efforts as currently an Excel-based product. Let's see, next slide, please. All right, so here's more of a detailed look at a page within the current assessment and samples of what kind of updates are being made to the assessment. So one of the parts, information available easily by hyperlink. So if you see that circled area at the top of the slide here where it's routing and location is circled, the point there would be to easily be able to click on that if you didn't understand what do we mean by routing and location. There's definitions there. The next items as an example. So if I was trying to answer, well, what do we have for selective routing currently? What are the options? So the work groups were trying to develop what those options could possibly be, put in a drop-down format so you can select these are the options of what we mean. By selecting those, you'll see the next item on the slides, automatically populating. So based on the answer provided or the option selected by the user, a maturity level is filled in automatically. We try to provide as much detail on the acronyms that are used within the document to be consistent and to use terms that each person who's filling out the document would be familiar with. Next slide. I think that covers the main part. At this point, we as a working group, as we're trying to make final work product completion to move on to demos, we're looking for our next steps, which would be to have volunteers review the assessment, the sub-element descriptions, and help us just work through the spreadsheet and see that it's meeting the needs of those that are filling it out. We expect the effort to begin within the next 2 to 4 months, and any of you on the call that have an interest in participating in this next stage of evaluating the progress of this work group, you can please send an email to NG911WG at hq.dhs.gov. And that, one more slide, Sherry. Just if you wish to contact me directly, my information as the chair of the Next Gen Working Group is on there. Steve Verbill from the state of Connecticut is our vice chair. And as mentioned earlier, Jerry Jaskolski is a federal lead, and he and the team at OEC have done a tremendous amount of work to bring us this far. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sherry.
Thank you. So thanks to both Mark and David, as well as Jerry. So we will now begin our question and answer period.
Thank you, Sherry. Our first question, how did you decide on the maturity stages?
So, well, from my perspective, this is Mark, and as far as deciding on the maturity stages, they were a work product of the TFOPA group. They identified what those maturity stages were, and we have simply moved forward with the definition of those maturity states. I couldn't tell you how they actually ended up with the 6 that they defined.
I can. This is Lori. David, go ahead if you have an answer. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, in fact, that was one of the really important things that working group did, because in general, when TFOPA started, there was a recognition that we had legacy, lots of legacy PSAPs out there, and lots of, perhaps a smaller number of PSAPs that were in some version of a transition to next generation 911. Nobody had really achieved full next generation 911, but that even talking about the transition required breaking it down into more categories. And so if you look at the maturity model and the 6 stages, what you really see is that the transition itself is broken down into several different stages, and the task force actually spent a lot of time thinking about how to identify the stages in the maturity model, and I think what that then results in is providing a common measuring stick for everybody to use, so that if you say that you're in the transition to next generation 911, you can also identify whether you're in an early transitional state or a later transitional state that gets you closer to the end goal. So it was really the work of the task force that came up with those elements.
Yeah, this is Lori. Just one thing to add to what David said. It was adapted from a model that was adopted for a cost estimate that the National 911 program is about to release. And the original model came out of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and it was a model for information sharing that required very little, if any, change to adapt to the model of NG911. So it was adopted by TFOPA and now this group.
Thank you. The next question, can you please remind the callers on the webinar today what SAFECOM is?
Sure, this is Mark. If I could, to remind the callers, so let me just back up to what I mentioned earlier and make sure that was clear. So SAFECOM, as I mentioned earlier, was a presidential initiative that came following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and that initiative was to develop a group that would support the efforts of the Department of Homeland Security in improving public safety communications and interoperability. That was formed in 2001, late 2001, early 2002, and began to develop members in that group that represent all levels of public safety and government, from the federal, the state, and the local communities. And it includes membership from many of the major public safety organizations. So members of SAFECOM would include National APCO, the National Chiefs Association, the National Sheriff's Association, the National Public Works Directors as their input, National EMS, and so on. So hopefully that'll give you an idea of how it started.
Thank you. Is the self-assessment intended to be performed at the state or regional municipal level?
This is Mark again. The intent right now is it could be performed at any one of those levels. Our goal to design the assessment could be clear down to the specific PSAP, where a PSAP would look at in each one of those categories, where do they stand in the transition to next gen. There may be, which we already recognize, that across the nation there are statewide programs that manage that, for which it would be better and probably more appropriate to be done at the statewide level. And there are states that have jurisdiction level decisions about moving to next gen. So right now it could be done by any one of those levels of governance.
Thank you. Is the new scorecard available for the public to view?
It's not available at this point. As we are moving through our transition here, we're trying to develop the enhanced scorecard, I guess, if you will. And our next effort will be I guess you could call it a pilot project, where the work that we've completed, we want to issue to some PSAPs that have an interest, or some statewide offices that have an interest, and help us to make sure that we've addressed the issues and made it easy to fill out. And then it'll be moving forward and eventually be released, so it would be available to the, I guess, public, if you will, public safety community.
Thank you. Our next question, both David and Mark mentioned funding and resource allocation. Would you please elaborate on resource allocation and what is included?
David, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. I mean, I think the without doing a whole deep dive on Working Group 3, what Working Group 3 was looking at was both how to potential models for funding sources in a next generation 911 environment, particularly as traditional 911 fees that are assessed on landline telephones and wireless phones may, as people may shift away from landline, for example, those revenues may drop, and therefore you need to come up with funding models that will sustain next generation 911 going forward. There was also a large effort, and actually this was a big part of what Working Group 2 did, to look at how to ensure that resources are spent in a cost-effective way. And so both Working Group 3 and Working Group 2 were looking at those questions, and a lot of those questions boil down to questions of scale, to whether whether next generation 911 transition issues should be tackled at the state level, at the regional level, at the local level, and kind of what are the cost and resource trade-offs of doing it in those different ways.
Okay, thank you once again to both David and Mark. And Lori, I am now going to ask you to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Sherry. So our next speaker this afternoon is Adam Wasserman. He is the E911 coordinator for the E911 unit of the Emergency Management Division of the Washington Military Department. That's a mouthful. It has been my pleasure to work with Adam on a number of things. I love going out to Washington. They have sort of this why not, let's try it kind of attitude that I find really contagious. I'm looking forward to figuring out how to help support his continuing efforts to integrate the military and civilian 911 systems. And so without further ado, the floor is yours, Mr. Wasserman.
Thank you, Lori. Good morning. My name is Adam Wasserman. As Lori said, I'm the Washington State Enhanced 911 Coordinator. Today I'm going to be discussing the connection between DoD 911 and local authority 911 here in Washington State. A quick little background on myself. I've been in the position for about 2 years, and prior to that, I retired from the Coast Guard after 22 years of service. So for today's discussion, I want to focus on some of the different types and styles of relationships that have been forged here in Washington State. I doubt I'm going to tell anyone anything new about this topic, but hopefully we'll give you an idea of how we are addressing things here in Washington State. So next slide. Okay, first a little background on 911 in the state of Washington. We have 39 counties, and we are a very strong home rule state, which means that the counties are responsible for the operation of 911. The state's responsibility is we run the ESINet, the network that all the 911 traffic travels on, and we also provide financial support to some of the counties in order to ensure a baseline of 911 services available statewide. We have approximately 83 registered PSAPs, and I emphasize registered throughout the state. They're not all under the purview of the state or counties, and not all of them are connected to our ESINet. That number is closer to about 60. For the most part, each county has a single PSAP, with the exception of some of our larger counties like King and Pierce. We also have 8 PSAPs run by the Washington State Patrol. We have some tribal-run PSAPs and several federal and DoD-run PSAPs, including one on Mount Rainier, and several of the colleges have their own small little PSAPs. So as you can see in Washington, we have a good variety of PSAPs, diverse in size, control, governance, and mission. Next slide. So we became interested in this discussion about DoD and civilian 911 and began talking with Joe Wassel and Dr. Chan from the Pentagon and Lori Flaherty from the 911 office in D.C. about DoD 911, and we asked them to come out and visit Washington, where we have several DoD installations that vary and are very diverse, and we think we have a really good makeup that kind of covers what the rest of the U.S. is facing. These installations are covered by 3 major PSAPs: Fairchild Air Force Base, Joint Base Lewis McChord, and then the Navy Regional PSAP in Bremerton, which covers several of the different naval installations. Just as these installations are different, so is the engagement between the locals and the DoD when it comes to 911. As we looked at it, it really comes down to about 3 different relationships we have with these 3 different PSAPs here in Washington. We have a limited one, we have one that's more of a coexisting and working alongside, and then a fully integrated relationship. And as you see, as we discuss them, they each have their pros and cons, and they were usually, the style of relationship we have with them is usually forged over time and impacted by numerous variables, and doesn't necessarily mean that one method or relationship is better than another one. Next slide. So the first relationship is what we call a limited one, which is exampled by Fairchild Air Force Base and Spokane County, which is our largest county out on the eastern side of the state. There's a very close relationship with the first responders from the base and from the outside community, but the relationship with the 911 on the inside and outside is not as connected. Fairchild receives the calls, all the calls from the base. They're kind of a self-contained base where if you call from the base, anywhere on the base, those calls are going to come out to the network and then pop right back into the base 911. And there's really not a lot of interaction or overlap with the civilian community. Now, of course, we have, the calls that get slightly misrouted or just off a little bit, especially with cell phones, and those calls are transferred. So there is that relationship between them and the community. Some of the positives of this type of relationship is it's very, very simple. They are just another 911 PSAP in the area. Some of the cons is without that interconnection between the county and the base, there's sometimes a missing of shared information and shared resources that we're losing out on. Next slide. So the next example of relationship is a kind of a coexisting or working together, we would say. So the Navy regional PSAP structure, or the Navy regional structure, their PSAP is located in Bremerton, Washington, which falls within Kitsap County. In addition to the Navy bases in Kitsap County, the Bremerton PSAP also handles 911 for the installations in other counties in the state, like Whidbey Air Station or the Naval Station up in Everett, which are in Island County and Snohomish County. There's also some jurisdictional overlap that we see, especially in the areas of public, private, military housing. Some of the off-base housing is a mix of both military members and civilian members. And because of this joint responsibility, the county's PSAP and the Navy region PSAPs have a very close working relationship and work very well together. They're aware of each other's processes. When calls are transferred, they know which calls need to have civilian law enforcement as well as military law enforcement on it. So it's a pretty good relationship. So obviously the positive of that is they have a good understanding of the other side of the fence line, and they know what to expect when they're handling a call jointly. Some of the cons is location. So obviously Kitsap County and the Bremerton PSAP work very closely together. But some of the counties where Bremerton PSAP handles the calls, but the counties are farther away, there's not as close of a connection. Next slide. And then the final style of relationship that we see here in Washington State is what we would call a fully integrated style, which is what we have in Pierce County with Joint Base Lewis-McChord. The county's designated JBLM as a primary PSAP to take on calls in their AOR. And there's also a very close relationship. The county has assisted them with maintenance on their equipment, helped them with some of the training of their call takers. It's a unique situation, especially with the way JBLM is set up. Many of you probably, I don't know, I guess it was national news that when we had the train derailment on I-5, well, that was just very close to JBLM, and actually those initial calls went to JBLM. So JBLM has jurisdiction kind of taking those calls right along I-5 because of the way I-5 splits the two bases. That type of integrated relationship at the 911 level ensured that there was no delay in response to that incident. Another positive of this is they're able to back each other up. Calls from Pierce County, if they need to, can go to JBLM as a backup and vice versa. Some of the cons of a situation where they're so closely integrated, whenever there's money involved, and jurisdictional issues can always arise when they're working so closely together. So boundary lines can sometimes become a little bit blurred. Next slide. So as we've shown, there are pros and cons to each of the different types of relationships that we have here in Washington State. And again, I'm focusing on the relationships at the 911 level and not necessarily the first responder level where sometimes the relationships are a little bit closer. But there are also a lot of challenges and obstacles that we face as well. Obviously, the political issue, federal versus local authority, and some of the different rules. Desire for presumption of control. Sometimes the base politics can influence the relationship between the civilian community, 911, and the base. Perception, if there's not a close connection between the 911 leaderships, sometimes we see that people don't know how things are operated on the other side of the fence or what is going on, and sometimes assumptions are made that they may not be doing 911 the right way or doing it as good as they can be. Overlapping AOR and jurisdiction, we see, obviously the soldiers and sailors from these bases live in the communities, in the civilian communities, but there's also a lot of overlap because a lot of civilians who don't have a DoD connection are working on the bases or accessing the bases for different reasons. Probably one of the biggest challenges we've seen is continuity. One thing I've learned about the 911 community here in Washington is that you're either in it for 1 year or 30 years, really no in between, and it's sometimes difficult for them to understand how the base 911 point of contact changes every year or if someone transfers. This is not the case for all of them, but we have seen issues where the civilian 911 will reach out to the base 911 and there's a change in leadership. Sometimes there's also change in base leadership on the base, which can impact how they emphasize or their emphasis on 911 and also how they view engagement with the surrounding community. So even a change of command on the base can change how 911 relationships off the base are handled. And then finally, technology. As we're moving to next-gen 911 here in Washington and we're upgrading equipment, it's very expensive, and sometimes the bases, especially some of the smaller bases, don't have the money or that money has not been prioritized for them to upgrade their equipment. So that has been another hurdle that we have faced. Next slide. So as we looked across, we found a couple of best practices that have helped in Washington and some that we would like to implement in Washington. The first off is top-down guidance for all of DoD. As was described, there's a huge disparity of how 911 operates in the DoD. The Navy's regional concept means that calls from Whidbey Naval Station are treated just like one from Bangor Sub Base or from Bremerton Shipyard. But in the other services, calls in Fairchild are not necessarily handled in the exact same manner as McChord Air Force Base, even though they're both Air Force bases. So that lack of consistency in the DoD is challenging when we look at it from a state level because they're not treated the same, so we have to treat each of them individually and different. Second, standards. One of my goals as the state coordinator is that no matter who you are or where you are within our state boundary, whether you're on a federal installation or tribal land or traveling down I-5, that you have the same positive experience when you dial 911. Importance, as discussed earlier, changes or different base commanders will have different emphasis on 911. Partnerships, bringing the 911 administrators and telecommunicators together and bring them all under the umbrella of the 911 community in Washington has been a great thing that we've really just started to do, inviting them to our advisory committee meetings, sharing training opportunities with them, and just making sure there's some inclusion of them in the greater community. Of course, having the clear responsibilities, and anytime you can have an MOU, that's always better. I know there are well-written MOUs between base fire and county fire or law enforcement, but I'm not sure how many 911 memorandums of understanding there are between the base DoD and their civilian counterparts. Next slide. So as I had mentioned earlier, we're working with Joe Wassel, Dr. Chan, and Lori to try to develop kind of a pilot project here in Washington, since we have these different varying styles of relationships with the DoD, and hoping that we can at least create some kind of standards. One size is not going to fit all. Just the way Fairchild is aligned doesn't necessarily mean they need to be fully integrated with Spokane 911. Their style kind of works for them. So there's not really one style fits all, but there can be one system and one standard that fits all. just like when I'm dealing with the 39 counties in Washington, they're all different sizes, different needs, different resources. Yet as a state, we try to have a standard for 911 that fits everybody. Next slide. And so in the end, it's all about the relationships and making sure that we're fostering the best solution for the situation we have. And we continue to try to make the 911 community in Washington truly one community that includes not only the DoD, federal, tribal, state, and that everyone has the same experience when they call 911. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Adam. We'll now begin our question and answer period. As a reminder, if you have a question, you can use the chat feature or raise your hand.
Thank you, Sherry. Our first question asks, how are calls transferred into the base?
Well, currently, all of the bases are on our ESINet. We're in the middle of a transition to a new ESINet. So calls will go out, will go into our ESINet, and then the ESNs are directed to the base. So they'll just drop right back in.
Thank you. Do you get location from an on-base 911 call?
Yes, and that's probably another challenge that I should have mentioned in the call, is the way bases do some of their addressing has been a challenge because it doesn't necessarily fit in with our ESINet as we're doing addressing. So we've had to make some challenges trying to get them on the same page. But yes, we do get the addressing.
And how is mutual aid handled? CAD to CAD, radio, phone?
I think most of the mutual aid is handled at the CAD, but if there's dissimilar CAD systems, sometimes we have some challenges there. And I think it can be run a little bit different for each. I'll have to check on that.
Okay. What differences have you found between the branches of the military?
I think the biggest difference we've found is in the style. So the Navy has a regional concept where they have a regional PSAP that handles for all of the Navy bases in the region, where the other ones are individual bases are self-contained as far as they run 911 the way they run 911. So there's a lot more differences between the other services where the Navy has a little more consistent, at least within the naval installations.
Thank you. Have you extended your inclusive model to other federal jurisdictions, such as DOE sites?
Yes, we have. And actually, we just have included the Department of Fish and Wildlife has just signed up and is our newest PSAP in the state. So we're trying to spread the net to every PSAP and everyone in the 911 community.
What advice do you have to other areas who are beginning to work with DoD?
The best advice is to meet with the people, meet with the base leadership, meet with the 911 folks, bring the local jurisdiction who's responsible for 911, and just sitting down across the table from them, you can iron out so many of the questions and concerns that everyone has, and I think that's probably the best bit of advice.
Thank you.
Okay. So once again, I'd like to thank all our speakers today, Mr. Firth, Mr. Buckholz, and Mr. Wasserman. Lori, do you have any closing remarks?
I'd just like to echo what you said. Thank you to all of you for sharing this information. If you would like to participate as a test PSAP or test agency for the digital checklist, please let us know. We can put you in touch with Mark and that group, and we look forward to working with Adam as he continues the pilot out in Washington. Thank you all.
Thank you. This concludes today's webinar. We appreciate everyone's participation. An archived version of today's webinar will be available on 911.gov soon. Thank you and have a great day.